This is a really important part of the ecosystem. So if we're thinking about the ecosystem, we're really looking into the serve area, and we're really particularly looking at a very specialised area. So it's really good to have Huge, who's got years and years of experience with his wife Pauline in raising up leaders and sending them out and holding on to a few of them as well. So Huge, welcome to
yeah, it's
the
a pleasure.
Limo.
Yeah, looking forward to this.
Now, can I just ask Eugene, what's your sort of history? Who discipled you? How did you get into ministry?
I just had lots of. I think one of the things that I've picked up over the years is when I was a student, I've always had pastors who've involved me in the life of the church. Pastor Joe Mock gave me my first preaching opportunities. I was 20, and he gave me preaching opportunities as a 20-year-old. I had youth leaders who would actually draw alongside me to teach me how to play an instrument, who modeled for me how to lead in music teams. And so I think one of the things that I've taken away over the years is the only reason why I'm in ministry is because someone drew alongside me and gave me ministry opportunities. Yeah, and I think that's one of the keys to actually raising leaders for ministry.
Now, Eugene, you're getting a little bit long in the tooth.
Thanks for that, Scott.
Are you finding it harder now that you're older to be patient to invest in the next generation?
No, I'm not a grumpy old pastor. One of the things I also realized is the longer you are in ministry, it's easy to get impatient at people. And I've seen like pastors who've been around for too long, and you just go, look, they're too grumpy. They've stayed at the place for too long. And so what I've always sought to do is I've always sought to stay focused, keep investing in the next generation. I said really recently at our church, one of our plans is to raise 10 gospel workers in the next 10 years, but I think that's too small a vision. We've got to think about raising 100 gospel workers in the next 100 years, because that's the kind of legacy we want to leave behind, so the ministry of the gospel continues. So I think I begin to realize as you get older, I think our vision for ministry is, I think, too small. We've got to think future generations, much, much more.
Excellent. Well, Eugene, I'm going to hand it on over to you.
Cool.
Building a training hospital.
Thanks for that, guys. Good to actually meet with you guys. I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a couple of slides coming up. And so the first slide is going to come up. Okay, so the first slide that comes up really is addressing this question that we are asking today, which is how do we build churches that are deliberately investing in leaders and incubating the next generation of gospel workers in an ongoing, deliberate way? And it is a fundamental question because you can't grow the ministry of the gospel without raising leaders. You can't continue the ministry of the gospel without raising gospel workers. Your future missionaries, your future evangelists, pastor teachers, your future parachurch leaders. You can't grow a church without raising leaders as well, without raising gospel workers within the church community. Think of your Sunday school teachers. Think of your youth group leaders. Think of your future elders and deacons. And so what I want to do in this learning lab, and my associate is going to help me in a moment, is to help you think through what it takes to build a church community that's deliberately investing in leaders or the next generation. A church community that's actually incubating the next generation of gospel workers in an ongoing, intentional, deliberate way. Hopefully the next slide will come up. If you know anything about the scriptures, the Bible actually has two commissions. I don't know whether you realize this, there are two commissions in the Bible. What I call the two great commissions. And the first commission, and there it is, the slide should be up, the Bible's horizontal and vertical commission. The first commission really is about making disciples so the gospel goes out. I think we're all very familiar with that. That's mission. We're called to evangelize the nations. But there's also a commission to make disciples so the gospel goes down to the next generation. And that's the mission within evangelizing the generations. So not just in making disciples who will make disciples of the nations, but also making disciples who will make disciples within the life of the church community, the next generation. Making disciples who will keep leading the mission of the church. Making disciples who will be the next generation of Pauls and Timothys and Euodias. And so you'll notice there on the outline or on the slides, two commissions in the Bible, the horizontal, the Great Commission for the gospel to go out, and then the vertical. In fact, Psalm 78, verse 1 to 8 has been very key for me in the life of ministry in the last 20 years. Many years ago, one of the pastors in Sydney pointed this out to me. And he said, if you read Psalm 78, you notice that it's God's purpose for the gospel to go down from generation to generation. And so Psalm 78, let me read that for you. The psalmist says, "My people, hear my teaching, listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter hidden things from old, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us." Here it is, verse 4. "We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done." He's talking about the great saving work of God in the Exodus. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children, so that the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. And so you notice that even in the Old Testament, there is a vertical commission for the saving work of God to go down from generation to generation. Now, you do find that in the New Testament as well, because in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, and again, a very significant verse that I think we know of, but it doesn't shape our ministry priorities. And 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, I think that's another significant one that reminds us that the gospel must go down. Paul says to Timothy, "The things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, the gospel entrust, put into the hands of reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." And so you notice that there is a vertical commission for the gospel to go down from generation to generation. Now, all of you, most of you listening in, you're pastors, and so the first commission, the horizontal commission, is very clear. We know that there is a mission to the nations. But notice there's a clear mandate for the gospel to go down as well to the next generation. So what I'm going to do with you, I mean, there's many principles. I'm going to just highlight 3 key principles to help you think about how you actually do this. How do you build a church that's deliberately investing in leaders, a church that's an incubator for the next generation of gospel workers? So that's what we're going to do. So here's the first principle. The next slide should come up. This is principle number 1. And principle number 1 is really equipping culture. That is the key. Equipping culture is the key. It takes an equipping culture to raise leaders. So before you can think of your church community as a training hospital, because what we want to do is build a training hospital, you've got to think of your church community as a garden or a field. Leaders are not raised in a vacuum. They're raised in a healthy garden, a growing field. And so one of the key principles in raising gospel workers is growing and equipping culture in your church community. We planted our church about 20 years ago. We were committed to 2 things. Those 2 things were building God's people to reach God's world. All right. And what that means for us was to grow a people who would love Jesus, who would love and serve each other in community, and who would love and serve God's world. Many of you are familiar with the 5M ecosystem. It's effectively the same thing. Growing people in magnification, membership, maturity, ministry, for mission. And so unless you're building God's people, you can't move the next step. Now, you'll notice that I did not say growing leaders to reach God's will. Because if you're building or growing God's people, if the garden is healthy, if the field is thriving, your leaders will start to emerge. Your future gospel leaders will start to grow. Unless you're working to equip all God's people, you will not have leaders, let alone future gospel workers. And so the key is really equipping culture. You're familiar with Ephesians 4, verse 11 to verse 13. Where does the equipping of leaders start? Well, it starts with the equipping of your church community for ministry. And if you do that, you will see leaders emerge. You'll see pastor teachers emerge. You'll see Sunday school teachers emerge. You'll see future missionaries emerge. If you could go to the next slide, if we move to the next slide, many of you know Colin Marshall. If you read his book, Cole used to actually say, and he wrote The Trellis and the Vine, one of the books that I'm recommending. He used to say, we need to think of raising leaders in our churches in terms of an hourglass or a funnel. As we equip, right, at the congregational level, we'll see leaders emerge. You'll see leaders emerge in a funnel, your Timothys and your Euodias. And so what actually happens is this whole thing, the diagram you have in front of you, the hourglass, that's the incubator. And I think in our session, maybe about 15, 20 minutes from now, Elliot, who's our associate minister at Grace Point, he's responsible for our ministry M. He's going to talk about the middle part of the funnel. Once you've identified those leaders, what do you do with your Timothys and your Euodias to get them through the funnel? Now, if we move to the next slide, you'll notice on the next slide, one of the key questions to ask when it comes to equipping culture is this one. What are you doing that's leading, equipping, and organizing your people towards maturity, personal maturity, towards ministry, serving in some form, and mission or evangelism? And I think there are three levels, depending on your church community. You've got to think of what are you doing to equip people in personal maturity, ministry, and mission. What's the pathway for making disciples at a personal level in your church community for all your people? The second level is really your small group level. I assume that one of the things we try to do in our churches is to gather people into small groups where they do life together around God's word. We grow in community. It takes a community to grow people. And so what are you doing at a small group community level to grow your people in what we would call small group maturity, small group ministry, serving together, and small group mission? What's the pathway there in your small groups? And then the third level is the ministry. How are you equipping your people for actual ministry, using the diversity of gifts God has given them? So I assume that if you've got 80 or 180 people or 270 people in your church, what are you doing to work out where your people in terms of ministry using the gifts God has given them? And so those are the three levels you've got to think through to start thinking of how to build equipping culture. That's the first principle. Work out a plan to equip your people for maturity, ministry, and mission. And that actually means don't just ask them to be involved in ministry. Don't just dump them in ministries. You know, one of the things as pastors is there's always lots of stuff to do at church. We're always looking for volunteers. And it's very easy to invite people to do stuff in the life of the church. But many of us don't take time to actually equip them for that ministry, or we don't explain to them how their gifts can actually contribute to the growth of the body of Christ. And so because of that, they lose momentum very quickly. And so one of the things we do at our church community, we don't just encourage people to join our small groups, for example. We actually walk them through what we call an onboard document to explain to them the purpose of our small groups, our goals for them in terms of maturity, ministry, and mission, what we expect of them and what they can expect of us. And so we do that because we want to equip and we want to explain what we're actually doing. At Grace Point, we don't just put people into areas of ministry. We walk them through training papers. So you can't serve in any ministry in the life of our church community without someone walking through a training paper with you to show you how you serve, how this ministry contributes to the life of the church, from managing the sound desk to welcoming, to Bible reading, to leading teams. It's actually something we learned from EV Church here on the Central Coast. Many years ago, I know they don't have it anymore. Andrew Hurd used to have all these training papers for all these different training papers for all these different areas in the life of his church. And he used to actually have those training papers uploaded online and available. And so I think this was about 15 years ago. And so I remember reading them, downloaded them, rewrote them for our church community. And that's actually helped us create an equipping culture, because you can't serve if you're not trained. So I want to encourage you, work the soil, the garden. A healthy field produces healthy plants. And out of a field of healthy plants, you'll find your leaders. You'll find your future gospel workers. And look, just to give you guys a sense of scale, we're actually not a very big church in our church community. We have about 370 adults who are regulars on our books. More come on Sunday, but they're not regular. But we have about 370 regulars or in our small groups. And out of the 370, 23 of them are Sunday school teachers. 15 of them assist in Sunday school. We've got about 17 young adult leaders, about 14 youth leaders, and then we've got about 44 small group leaders. So that's 30% of our regulars in some form of leadership at Grace Point. That excludes our team ministry leaders. And alongside that, we've got about another 37 who are training for small group leadership, going through the first phase of our training program, and another 15 this year. So that's about 30% of our church involved in some form of leadership. And that has come about really because of our commitment to creating an equipping culture. And so that's the first principle, equipping culture. Next slide. Here's principle number 2. Always be on the lookout for emerging leaders. If there is an equipping culture, if the garden is healthy, if the fields are thriving, you'll see emerging leaders. You'll see Timothy and Euodias worth watching, worth encouraging, worth investing in, worth equipping, worth taking the next step in leadership with you. Now, 2 Timothy 2:2 tells us to entrust the gospel to reliable people who are able to teach and do likewise. I assume that means people who are qualified, people who are tried and tested in terms of those 3 things: maturity, ministry, mission. And I think you need to know, or we need to know, what we're actually looking for. You know, the old adage used to be, look for people who are faithful, available, and teachable. And we still need to do that. We need to look for fat people, potential Christian leaders. But reliability takes more than just enthusiasm and competency. It takes character and maturity. We all know that. Competency without conviction, or competency or skill without knowledge and character is always disaster in the making. And so start with character. And so let me suggest a few things that we should be looking for in an emerging leader. And, you know, I think sometimes one of the things I found is the longer you are in ministry, your standards tend to increase, which is a good thing, but it's also could be a negative thing, especially when it comes to emerging leaders, because sometimes our standards are too high. And so I've always reminded myself that everyone is work in progress, which is why you've got that little picture of the plants that are actually growing. And so let me suggest a few things that you should be looking for, that I certainly look for in my emerging leaders. And really, I'm looking for these things: a growing character, a growing conviction, a growing competency, growing in capacity, and a growing cultural intelligence, right? And so growing in character, I'm always looking for someone who's growing in Christ-likeness. Do they display humility? That's a big one for me. Do they display teachability? Do they display servant-heartedness? You know, do they go out of their way really to serve like Jesus without being asked? The second one is conviction. Do they display a growing knowledge of the Bible? Do they love the Word? You want someone who loves to read and study and grow in the Word. The third one is competency. Are they growing in skills? Are they interested in being skilled up to lead, to serve in the ministry they're in? It doesn't have to be teaching ministry, because we're looking at emerging leaders and they got to be serving, right? Are they growing in capacity? Because one of the things you discover in ministry is that leaders need to grow in capacity, because the capacity will actually dictate their level of leadership and their ability to lead well. Are they growing in the emotional and physical resilience needed to serve in ministry amidst all the challenges and responsibilities around them? And so, you know, I look for things like, are they disciplined with time? Are they able to self-manage themselves? Are they able to regulate their emotions when they're stressed? So capacity. And the last one is, are they growing in cultural intelligence? Are they growing in the ability to work with people around them? What's their relationships with people like, right? Are they abrasive? Do they rub people the wrong way? How do they relate to people? And so the key really, equipping culture, equip the saints, and then start looking for emerging leaders you can invest in. That's principle 2. Here's the third principle. Here's principle 3. Plan and make the equipping of leaders a priority. I know what it's like to be in pastoral ministry. Ministry is always busy. The urgent takes over. There's plenty of things to do in ministry. So you have to plan to make the equipping of your leaders a priority. And so here's the first thing. Plan for formal and structured pathways. Plan for something structured to grow your leaders. Have you got a pathway for leadership growth and development? And I think you've got to work that out depending on the scale of your church or how big or small it is. When we first planted our church, we only had 30 people. Our small group leaders, what I would do with them, our formal structured pathway was we would meet every week, about just a small group of us, and we would meet to study doctrine. We worked through the Westminster Confession of Faith like good Presbyterians. That's what they needed, a theological framework to think about church and life and ministry. But as the church grew, our leaders training became more formal. And so we put together, a leadership equipping course. Every leader went through an 8-week orientation to leadership, looking at our vision and mission, looking at leadership and character, leadership and personal disciplines, leadership and evangelism. And then we push every single leader through Next Gen as well, Strand 1, 2, and 3. So the question I ask is, what's your leadership pathway? For us at Grace Point, one of the things we also try to think very carefully about is before we move people into different levels of leadership, we have to see them in ministry. We have to see them, which is why it's good to know your leadership pathway, right? We want to see them serving in a ministry under others, right? Are they teachable? We want to see them do one-to-one discipleship. Can they disciple someone? We want to see them in small group ministry. Can they lead a small group? Before we move them into other areas of leadership, like leading teams or leading a ministry in the life of the church. And so what's your pathway? That's number one. Number two, plan and equip one-to-one and in groups. As you think of your emerging leaders or the leaders in the life of your church, are you or is someone walking with your emerging leader, with your leaders personally? Are you or is someone personally investing in your emerging leaders or your existing leaders? And are they being equipped in a small group, right? Are you bringing them together to train and equip them in a small group? Are you gathering them as a community of leaders? Because iron sharpens iron. That creates accountability. That creates community where they can grow and learn together. So that's number two. Number three, plan and equip your leaders with a framework. Have you got a framework to grow them in character and conviction and competency and capacity and cultural intelligence? Now, there are many frameworks out there, right? But have you got a framework to grow your leaders, right? Some people use the CKS framework, character, knowledge, skill, or the 3C framework, character, conviction, and competency. But there are many frameworks. But what's your framework for training and equipping your leaders? And so here are three key principles that I think will actually help you start to create that deliberate culture that will help raise and grow leaders in the life of your church community. Three key principles. Number one, you need a healthy garden. Equip all your people for ministry. Build an equipping culture. Everyone serves. My job and your job is to equip all God's people for ministry. Number two, if the field is healthy, you'll see leaders emerge. And so start looking out for those leaders, identifying them. And then number three, plan and make the equipping of leaders a priority. Your existing leaders and your emerging leaders. And so here's slide 9, or the next slide. That's what it's supposed to look like. The key is equipping culture actually leads to an equipping or a training hospital for the next generation of gospel workers. I think Scott's coming back on.
Great, Hughes. That was really helpful to have some of those principles and have that clarity. Got a couple of questions coming through. Sure. My first question for you, just so that I can orient myself with some of the questions as they come through, is when did you actually start to sort of staff it and resource it? So it was there, part of your culture and your DNA, but when did you actually get intentional about it as a personally in the context of the life of Grace Point?
I think the training of leaders has always been a priority for me in ministry, because I'm acutely aware that the size of your ministry or growing your ministry always depends on the quality of your leaders. And so for me, that's always been a priority. Equip all the saints, but my time personally has to be invested in emerging leaders. And I think because that was always modeled for me. So the pastors that I had served under, worked with, that was what they were passionate about. Some of them did it quite organically, others did it quite intentionally. And so that's the reason why I think you've always got to be invested.
So there's that modeling aspect, and you talked, in your first point about the, creating a culture of it.
Yeah.
So modeling is a key part of that. What are these sort of other key cultural things that that you've done that you naturally do?
So one of the things we did was when we planted the church, and we don't say it as much today, which is a bit of a problem. I think this is one of the problems to become an established church. A lot of things just fall off the radar. So this has been good for me to think through as well. But what we would often say at Grace Point is we would always say everyone serves. Everyone serves. And that came from the front. And so if you join our church community, the assumption is you would serve, right? Everyone serves. Everyone has a gift. Everyone has a part to play in this community. So we would be constantly saying that from the front. You join a small group, and it was in the DNA of the leaders to think about, if you join one of our small groups, we want to find you a place of ministry and service in the life of our church. So, but from the front is important. Your leaders need to catch that vision. And so, but the key, like I said, is creating that culture.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.